Welcome to the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast.
We go caving because I don't have the money to have a rocket to go to Mars. So going caving is the closest I can come to exploring other worlds. So when things are going really well, you're seeing amazing things, and you're seeing those amazing things with a team of great people. And, you want to make sure you're working with those people to take care of these beautiful places.
Well, for me, the action is the juice. I'm in.
Say the word, Chef.
Let it rip.
Welcome to episode 121 of the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. Today we host Dave Jackson of CaveSim. You'll find that link in the show notes. Be sure to check them out. They are a simulated cave that they in a truck and they take around the country, and kids and groups and adults have a chance to practice caving skills inside a safe environment. While not an adventure racer, we invited Dave onto the show because his perspective on teamwork, fear management, how to work through tough times in tight spaces is a great benefit to the community, and we were delighted to have him on the show. Smart guy, knows a lot, and he was a wonderful guest. So sit back and relax and enjoy this episode of the Dark Zone. Our fan base continues to grow. Our listeners are up. Our subscribers are enjoying the content, and we enjoy your feedback. And remember, if you keep racing, we'll keep talking.
This is Bob Miller, founder of Wilderness Traverse. I'm inviting you to join us in July 2025 for our classic Canadian 30-hour adventure race. We're proud to have been selected as the Adventure Racing World Series North America Championship and are excited to welcome the continent's best teams to compete for the Bob the Beaver Trophy and free entry into the 2026 Adventure Racing World Championships. Just 4 hours north of Toronto, Sudbury offers an epic wilderness experience with forests, rugged trails, and abundant lakes. With the World Champs this September in British Columbia, this is the year to race in Canada. And here's a great bonus for our U.S. neighbors. With the strength of the U.S. dollar, it's great value for an incredible experience. Visit wildernesstraverse.com to register.
As listeners of Dark Zone know, we are big supporters of Ascend Leadership Through Athletics, working with women and girls in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ascend and their annual Hike for Her, hike and auction is right around the corner, Saturday, May 10th, 2025 in Sky Meadow State Park in Delaplane, Virginia. If you check our show notes, you can see registration information as well as their online silent auction. All are encouraged to follow those links and learn about the good work that Ascend is doing in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as always, they pay nothing for this spot. We enjoy the work that they do and are proud to support them. Welcome to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. From time to time, we go outside the adventure racing world and we bring in subject matter experts to teach us about other parts of adventure racing that they have deep knowledge on. And so for today's episode, we're joined by Dave Jackson from CaveSim. I was introduced to Dave through a fellow adventure racer. How you doing, Laura Latanzi? And Dave actually operates this company called CaveSim, where he has mobile caves that he takes around the country for educational purposes and for schools. He's a caver himself. He knows cave rescue. We all know, folks, adventure racing, we have caving from time to time. So why not get Dave on the show to talk a bit about it? So Dave, welcome to the Dark Zone. Delighted that you are here. Tell us about you and CaveSim and how you got started in this sport.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate being here. So I went to a little school you might have heard of called MIT. And at MIT, they had this outing club where you could do hiking and backpacking and ice climbing and all this stuff. And I had done some of that stuff before. And in the same office, there was a caving club. And I thought, hey, I've never tried caving before. Why don't I give that a shot? And so that's how it all started was, just exploring. In college, I started to lead trips and then did a little tiny bit of cave rescue where it was needed. And then back in 2008, I saw a real cave get damaged during a rescue operation, during a practice rescue. And I thought, this is kind of ridiculous. We're just practicing for cave rescue and we're damaging these beautiful places. So I thought, well, I should use my engineering skill to make a training device to teach the firefighters, the search and rescue teams, the EMS folks, how to move more carefully through a cave. And that's what CaveSim does, is it gives you feedback based upon how careful you are about not touching the fragile things in the cave. So if you don't touch the stalactites and the stalagmites and the fake cave animals and all of that in our system, then you get a better score on the computer interface.
Very often when adventure racers see there's going to be caving on a race course, caving involved somewhere like that, they get a little jittery, they get a little twisted a bit, because caving to them because they don't do it a lot and because it's a rare activity for us, the concern around it is higher. What do you tell first-time cavers who are going to go into the ground? How do you prepare them for that experience in advance of actually getting started?
Yeah, so I bring a lot of new people caving. So, I run this business, CaveSim, but I'm also a caver, and different cavers are interested in different aspects of caving, right? So some cavers are really interested in mapping. Some cavers are super interested in pushing the deepest caves, right? Finding the deepest caves. I'm interested in bringing new people. And what I tell new people is, this is a space that has been around for millions of years. And it's formed very slowly. And so it's very, very different than a mine, right? So in a mine, you've had some rock that's been blasted apart by, dynamite or, other explosives. And so you have all these fractures in the rock. The way a cave forms is that you have some little fissures, little teeny tiny fissures in the rock, and the water percolates through those fissures, and it very, very slowly dissolves the rock. And, when you're in a cave, you need to be situationally aware, right? So you're not going to go pulling on some rock that's held up by no apparent means, right? You're going to be cognizant of your surroundings. But the same is true if you were in, I'm right by Pikes Peak right now, right? So if you were on the side of Pikes Peak, it's January and you're up there, you're going to be situationally aware in that environment as well. So as long as you're situationally aware, as long as you have the appropriate gear, you're going to be fine. It's really, you're much more likely to get injured driving down the highway to get to the cave, if you're a caver, than you are on the trip. And
so to your point is that the fear and the danger around caving is primarily perceptual. It feels scary. It looks scary because it's new. People, they get rattled about it.
Getting rattled is actually part of your problem, right? So if you can stay calm and think logically about your environment, you'll be better off, right? So when I have a beginner group that I'm leading, I always remind people to look first, move second. And it sounds really obvious, right? But, at home or, in the woods, you jump over some log or whatever, and you're not going to fall that far. In a cave, you need to be cognizant of the fact that it wasn't designed by some architect, right? So it's not like your house where you can jump off this, the top of the stairs or whatever, and you'll be okay. So you need to be aware of your surroundings and look around first and then move. There's a component of caving that's vertical, right? There's rope work. And so, you just need to make sure, like any high adventure activity, right, that you are going through your checks of your gear. And it helps to be calm, right, to go through your gear methodically and make sure that you're being careful. Another thing you can keep in mind, especially if you're an adventure racer, right, and you're working as a team, you can check on the people in your team with a really, really simple check. You know the people really well, right? And you know what they normally look like, right? So if you look at somebody's face and their eyes are huge, that's a good sign that they're getting anxious about their surroundings. So, just looking at their eyes and then, just talking them through, right? Just, maybe get their mind on something else or, just help them to breathe more deeply. One of the interesting things, you mentioned a tight space, right? So there's a little paradox here, which is that if you're in a tight space and you freak out, your body gets physically larger because you tense up. If you can stay calm in a tight space, you're actually better off. And so, you just remind yourself that, it's the rock's not going anywhere. And, you don't need to push yourself beyond your limits, right? So I can fit through a squeeze box, which is an adjustable height wooden box. I can fit through a squeeze box at 7.5 inches. And I can only do that if I'm calm, right? But I'm not going to try to fit through a 7.5 inch space after caving for 8 hours and I'm in the back of some cave, right? So I make sure because the stakes are too high, right? So in a real cave situation, maybe I'm going to say, okay, well, I'll give myself an extra inch or something like that.
And so clearly you mentioned situational awareness and knowing your teammates and things like that. Adventure racing, as you've read and as you know, is we take part in a variety of high risk activities, right? We move quickly on bicycles, we go uphill, we go downhill. There's ropes very often involved, there's water involved, there's water rescue involved. There's all of that. There's exposure. So there's a whole litany of things that we do as a part of our sport. And it's not uncommon for a teammate to have a challenging time with one of those events, right? And they get nervous. And a common strategy that some teams use is the idea of box breathing to calm themselves down, where you breathe for 5 seconds, then you hold your breath and you breathe. And it's a way to lower the adrenaline. Mm-hmm. Are there any specific strategies that you've used during a caving experience when somebody's having a really hard time? You'll say to them, look at me, look at me, look at me. Do this thing, and this thing will help you get through this.
Yeah, what I would say, it's probably similar to box breathing. We have the concept of pursed-lipped breathing, right, where you smell the rose, right, take a deep breath through your nose, and then you blow out the candle, right, through pursed lips. And what that does is it increases the partial pressure of oxygen in your lungs, right? So a lot of people get worried about the bad air in caves. Usually, so the way a cave forms most of the time is that water has flowed from one end in and out some exit, right? So the water, there may still be water in there, but there's, at this point, if you're not cave diving, right? If you're just caving, there's airspace, right? And so it's usually the case that the cave is quote unquote breathing. So there's plenty of air, but if you are, in a situation where you need more oxygen, you could use that pursed lip breathing. On surface rescue, I have used a paper bag, right? Breathe into a loose paper bag around, I've used that on other folks. And that's a little bit of a different concept, right? Where you're actually increasing your CO2 levels. And so there you're actually kind of putting yourself to sleep a little bit. But I would say like the pursed lip breathing is probably a pretty good way to go. It's also just the case that, you just talk people through it, right?
And eventually the adrenaline flows out, they settle down, and they're able to proceed.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I've done a bunch of rescue. I've done a little bit of what's called large party rescue, right? Where there's an official call out to rescue team. And, we put together different components of the team. I've also done small party rescue. And, sometimes that just means keeping the person calm while I had a situation where a teacher that I was leading got stuck. So they had on this jacket, some kind of fleece thing, and they moved through a very tight passage. I had gone ahead of them. I'd already gone through, and they felt like they couldn't go forward. And so they backed up, and unfortunately their fleece bunched up and acted kind of like a cork. So thanks to their calmness, I was able to actually dig out under them. And that basically involved digging in the mud. So this particular cave, it was a wild cave. This particular cave had some active digs going on. And that means that people were looking for unexplored passage, right? And so I knew, okay, well, there's a shovel over here. And so I can go over there and I can get the shovel. And so I dug under this guy and I had him back up as far as he could, right? And then I lowered the floor, and then he could move forward. And of course, I'm digging like completely flat, right? I'm like, because it's a super tight crawl. But to his credit, he stayed calm through that whole experience.
Because he knew eventually, like when the immediacy of the event is happening, their panic sets in as a shot of adrenaline. Your body goes into a recovery mode. But he probably realized that agnostic to the amount of time it was going to happen, he would be rescued eventually.
Right.
And he might be like, listen, I really, really, really don't want to be here, but I won't be here forever. Right. And it's going to take a while to get me out of here. And eventually that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's worth noting that there are different ways to have issues, right? So like he was in a situation where everything around him was stable, right? In other words, the floor was mud and we could dig the floor, but the ceiling was very, very stable. It was, just a solid rock. There are times where people get into trouble if they make bad decisions, right? So like if you're digging in a cave and you decide to dig underneath loose rocks, which I know some people have done this, you can have an issue where those rocks then come down on you. And those loose rocks in caving, those are called breakdown. And, but really, rock fall is typically an issue when you are doing something you probably shouldn't be doing, or you're
inviting it on yourself.
Yeah, right. Now, there's another potential issue, and this is something people don't think as much about. It's actually a higher risk, and that is the risk of hypothermia, right? So you're fine when you're moving. There's no problem, right? Because caves, what they do is caves take the average year-round temperature, right? So around here where I live in Colorado Springs, the caves are 54, 56, somewhere in there. If you're up in the caves in the Spanish Peaks down in southern Colorado, you may have ice in those caves because, they're 32 or, below 32 degrees all year round. So, basically, if you stop, you may be fine, but if you stop, then what you need to do is you need to insulate yourself from the rock. And a great way to do that is to sit on your own pack. If some people bring a little piece of closed cell foam, like a slice of a sleeping pad. I just usually sit on my pack, but it's also important to delayer, like in any other activity, right? If you're sweating, you need to be delayering, because then when you stop, you need to be able to relayer and keep yourself warm.
Yeah, we did a race one time in Scotland where we had come through the crazy section. We were soaking wet getting off the water, and we thought we needed to be rescued. We did, and it worked out fine. But like another team that was with us took off all of their wet clothes, put on brand new dry clothes, stayed dry, and we had to start moving again. The wet clothes went back on, right? You have to avoid that. And I think from a safety perspective, whether you're above the ground or below the ground, the idea of being wet and having direct contact with the ground is a bad thing, because that it pulls the heat right out of you. So try to get a barrier between you and the ground. That's a very important part of it. You mentioned your pack before. Is there caving specific gear that you bring along? Obviously, helmets, lights, that makes complete sense. Shovels you mentioned. What other items would a caver bring with them into the ground?
Yeah, so, typically on my helmet, I've got 2 lights. And that way, if I'm in a tight crawl and I whack my helmet on the ceiling and I knock a battery loose or something like that, I can just reach up and turn on the other light. Or if I'm in a tight crawl, I may actually preemptively turn on both lights for that section. And then I would always have a third source of light. So I've got, maybe it's a flashlight or maybe it's another headlamp in my pack. My pack itself is special. And the reason it's special is that if you have any pockets in a pack, a lot of caving packs have no pockets, but if you have any pockets in a pack, the pockets are going to be on the inside. And that's just because you don't want stuff falling out. You're dragging your pack, you're throwing it, you're tying it to your ankle and hauling it. So some people use waterproof caving bags. It depends on what part of the country you're in, right? For out here in Colorado, I don't use a waterproof bag, but I actually made my cave pack myself out of an old Army duffel bag and a 1920 Singer sewing machine. Cool. Made one for me and one for my wife. But in your pack, you're going to have first aid, a little bit of first aid gear. You're going to have a little bit of rope, maybe some webbing. It all depends upon the cave, right? You may have vertical gear. The vertical gear that you're going to use in a cave is totally different than the vertical gear you're using for rock climbing. And the reason for that is you're not going to be climbing the wet rocks inside the cave. It's just impractical. And so instead, you're going to be climbing your own rope. And we're going to use static line because there's nothing really inherently dangerous per se about dynamic line, but you're going to be sitting at the bottom of your dynamic line with your ascenders, stretching that dynamic line until you start to ascend. Whereas with a static line, you basically, it'll stretch a little bit, right? So you're bouncing off the ground a little bit, but you can make progress a lot more quickly on a static line. Other things you want to have in your pack, I would have a hat. I've got gloves, knee pads, elbow pads. And, in some cases, those are going to be in my pack if I'm, moving through big borehole passage. And then, I deploy them. But what else would I have in my pack? Leave no trace is an important situation in caves because, we just don't get decomposition like you get on the surface, right? And so I bring a pee bottle and I bring what's called a WAG bag, which is basically a solid waste disposal kit. And if you're a caver and you want to sound cool, you call it a burrito kit. But there's, let's see, what else have we got? You're going to have, if you're in a cave that's been explored, you should have a map. and you can use a compass. You're not going to be using a GPS underground because there's no communication with satellites. But assuming that your cave is a typical run-of-the-mill cave, you're not going to have so much iron in that cave that it throws off your compass. If your compass gets thrown off, and I know some cave survey teams that have had issues with this, you could just elevate your compass off the rock floor and you'll get more accurate readings. A whistle is not a bad idea, right, for communicating with your team. Some things are right on and some things are right with. A little bit of flagging tape is good because then you can mark your way, right? We're not going to be spray painting to mark our way in caves, right? It's like Hansel and Gretel, right? You leave a little breadcrumb, in this case, a little piece of flagging tape. And when you come back out, you're picking up all that stuff. So you're not leaving something for, the pack rats to chew on and turn into part of their nest.
So am I assuming that is there a corollary between caving and mountain climbing when there's certain lines, right? And so you have a map, you have a line, and inside that line, you're like, okay, at this point here, you have to use that piece of gear. At this point here, you have to do that. When you have an explored cave, you go in there saying to yourself, okay, there's going to be the need for rope, need to ascend, things like that. How much exploring of new caves do you do personally? Like when you're looking for, or does most of your stuff already well covered?
Most of my stuff is well covered. I have certainly done digging that took me into passage that no human had ever been in before. And that's pretty exciting.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool thing to be the first person ever to be there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Now, I know a lot of cavers who that's all they do, right? And that's called project caving. And basically that means they're looking for new passage. They're trying to set, mileage records for a certain state, find the longest cave in the state or find the deepest cave in the hemisphere or, whatever. But my typical experience is that I'm going in a cave that's mapped so you know how much rope you need for different pits. I mean, when I went to Tennessee for program over the summer, and we went on some caving trips, and we did a pit called Never Sink, and that's a 160-foot pit. And there's not really much cave at the bottom, but there's a lot of really cool cave life down there. And so you make sure you've got more than 160 feet of rope for that drop. And you may have multiple drops. I went in another cave on that trip where we had a second drop inside the cave. You always make sure you're tying a knot in the end of your rope so you don't rappel off the end of your rope. Right. You're making sure you've got the right food and water. That's another thing that would be in your pack, for the duration of the trip.
A very common thing we talk about in adventure racing in the dark zone is the idea that this is a team-based sport and that everybody has to play a role in their team. And you mentioned cave rescues before, you mentioned caving. Can you talk about the team aspect when it comes to cave rescues, the roles, how does that unfold? Teach us about that.
Yeah, so for cave rescue, there is what's called an authority having jurisdiction, or an AHJ. And so that might be the sheriff, that might be the fire department, that, whoever that is. And so that person or that entity is in charge of a rescue. So a rescue usually gets started when somebody says, John didn't show up, right?
Right. They're overdue. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And so, as a caver, what we always do is we have what's called a surface watch. That doesn't literally mean that the person is sitting by the cave entrance. I mean, it could be, but it's rare for you to just have somebody posted by the entrance. But you tell 3 people where you're going. And that way, if you don't, you tell them when you're going to be out. And that way, if you don't show up by your call out time, they can initiate a rescue. And then if 911 gets called, hopefully they have the wherewithal to call the local fire department heavy rescue team. And hopefully there's been some training that's been done in collaboration with that rescue team. Like here in Colorado Springs, we train with Station 17, which is heavy rescue and confined space. So we bring them into the wild caves here and they get acclimated, familiarized with the caves. And so then when a rescue occurs, we as cavers, we report to the AHJ, and we're not the boss. We just say, we're here to help. If you need us, we have expertise in caving. I've definitely had a situation in a cave in Alabama where I was on a rescue, and my wife and brother-in-law and I, we were not the first, but some of the first people on scene. And we were the first people on scene who had training. And then at some later point, the fire department came in. We sent out some people to do a call out. and a captain on the fire department. I was in the process of talking with the patient, and this captain comes up and he tells me to shut up. And I pulled him aside and I said, hey, I'm Dave, and I'm, been trained by the Colorado Cave Rescue Network. And, I know you need to talk to your team, but I need to talk to the patient. And he said, honestly, I'm really freaked out in here, and I've never done a cave rescue before. So we were able to really, really effectively work together after that. Kudos to him for having the humility to realize what was going on. In the brain, we have the amygdala, right? And the amygdala is responsible for both fear and anger. And the amygdala gets confused, and it doesn't know if it's angry or if it's afraid. So he thought he was angry, and he was actually afraid. And so on reflection, he was able to, to realize, okay, well, here's a guy who is an asset to me, and I shouldn't piss him off. And then we worked extremely effectively together. We got the patient out. It took us 5 hours. There was some medication, intravenous medication that was administered throughout the process. But it was a successful rescue. So teamwork is really, really important. I think, in adventure racing, I'm sure you have really good teamwork. I always encourage people when they're caving with me to not play tricks on one another, right? So it's popular in caving to do what's called rocking somebody's pack, where you put a rock in their pack and you see how long will they foolishly carry this extra heavy pack around with the rock in it. And I am not a fan of that. I really don't think that that's constructive. I think we need to be setting a tone of, being positive with one another, not tricking one another, trusting each other all the time, even when the stakes are low, so that when the stakes are high, we know each other really well and we know we can trust one another.
So it's true, right? And then inside those events, you bond very, very closely with other people, right? The sharing of stressful situations creates this emotional connection between people, right? Chris Kalous, who does a podcast called the Normocast, which is a climbing podcast, which is the Dark Zone is a direct descendant of the Normocast. And if Chris is listening, I appreciate all that he does for the sport. I'm not a mountain climber, but I love his interviews, and he's very good there. He talks about how that when you're involved in a big mission in the mountains, it's war stories without the war, that you build those connections to each other. I'm assuming that the strenuous nature of caving, right, the inherent risk that's involved, working through enclosed spaces, being a team, that creates a stronger connection between people. Am I capturing that dynamic correctly?
Yes, absolutely, you are. Yeah, and one of the things that's true is that we go caving because I don't have the money to have a rocket to go to Mars. So going caving is the closest I can come to exploring other worlds. So when things are going really well, you're seeing amazing things, and you're seeing those amazing things with a team of great people. And, you want to make sure you're working with those people to take care of these beautiful places, because they're extremely fragile. It may take 1,000 years per cubic inch for some of this stuff to grow. When things go sideways, then you do end up having a very strong bond. And what's cool about it is that when you succeed with a rescue, and thankfully I've only had successful rescues, when you succeed with a rescue, it's very rewarding to know that you've helped a person, or, in some case, an animal, and you've accomplished something that's very, very meaningful for that individual.
So you say you rescued animals. You can't just drop that and not finish that story. What animals have you rescued? A grizzly bear? Like, who'd you pull out of a cave?
Only a dog. Okay. I was in a cave in Virginia with one of the guys who works with me on CaveSim. We have different teams with CaveSim. We have an education team, and we haul the mobile exhibits around the country, and we bring them to schools and such. And we have an education team to do that, and I'm leading that team. But then I'm also leading a construction team. And my production manager, Jesse, he was with me on a caving trip in Virginia. We went to a place called Giant Caverns, and it had been a show cave, which means, of course, it was something that people paid to go and see. And it has several entrances, and one of the entrances is vertical. And we were in Virginia for a couple of weeks, and we had some friends bring us, or friends of friends bring us to this cave. And it's got a rappel that's about 40 or 50 feet. And the reason I say about 40 or 50 feet is it's sort of shaped like a funnel. And so it's a little hard to say exactly where the drop starts. But the first member of our group rappelled in and said, there's a dog down here. And I said, what's its demeanor? Because obviously you want to...
Friendly dog, we're good. Not friendly, we have to have a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you fall 40 or 50 feet into a pit and you've been there for 3-4 days, you're going to be pretty chill. So the dog was pretty chill. And Jesse, who's really good with animals, he rappelled in next, and he brought some salami with him and, got a friend, right, by offering the dog salami, and gave the dog water. And then there were 4 of us total. I always think it's a pretty good idea to have 4 in your team. That way, if one goes down, you can have one stay with, and then 2 others can go for help. It's sort of a double buddy system. So we all got into the cave, and we talked about different strategies for getting the dog out of the cave. We talked about taking some of the timber that had fallen in to the pit and lashing it together and making kind of a stretcher. The wood was just really rotten. There was nothing we could do with it. And so we ended up taking a rope bag and a rope pad and making a sling out of it and strapping the dog to Jesse and then hauling Jesse up out of the pit. And the only way that's possible is with a pulley system. So we set up a 4-to-1 haul system, basically, and we use a thing called progress capture. And what that means is that we call it, in this case, we called it a pig line. And that means your 4 lines are not going all the way down to the patient or to the rescuer. You have 1 line going down, but you're using some ascenders to grab onto that line. And so you're hauling up a piece of the line. And then you can use progress capture to reset this haul system and take another shot at hauling him up. So we hauled him up out of the cave. It's not a straight shot, right? So there are places where you need to be using your feet against the wall to make sure that you're not just scraping into the wall. And we got the dog out, and we took the dog to the local animal hospital, and then we got on national news by mistake.
It was a slow news day, and they were happy to get you on the air, right? Caver's rescue dog, and everyone loves a good dog rescue.
Yeah, the good news is that so as rescuers, we don't like being in the news. It's not like, I want to be on the news. So, we try to follow something we call humble pride, right? We're proud of what we do, but we don't want to be, grandstanding. So, but the good news about us being in national news was that the shelter where the dog ended up going, it went from the hospital to the shelter. The shelter raised $5,000 as a result of all this publicity.
So, it's interesting you mentioned publicity. And when you take part in a sport that has elements of danger and risk to it, when something goes wrong, the public very often says, well, they shouldn't be doing it anyway. It's not designed to do that. What are the misconceptions that you have to push back about caving that the general public just simply don't get?
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions is that there's no oxygen, that there's rockfall all the time. They don't understand why we would go. Why would you go underground, right? What's the point? And seeing amazing things, being in a situation where you are just like in adventure racing, where you're working extremely closely with a team, you're getting a lot of positive feedback from the activity. And I find it, some people just don't like the dark, and that's okay. I find the dark to be really, really comforting. Like if I'm somewhere, I'm in some huge room, right, underground, where you could put many 747s, right? I actually find it comforting to be small. I think it's actually really nice to know that I'm not the biggest thing around. And the same is true, if you're climbing a huge mountain or something like that, right? It actually can be comforting to have a sense of being small. So what is the public misconception? I think a lot of people just don't think about caves, right? Like you go to a show cave and people are asking, how long did it take them to make this thing, right?
They dig for a long time. No, 100,000 years.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So, there's different levels of misconception, but I think at the risk of sounding arrogant, I think among the educated folks, I think the misconceptions are more around why would you do that? What's the point? What's the objective?
CaveSim is a big part of what you do, and I don't want to get too far down the road in an interview before you talked a bit about it. You and I have talked about it professionally. The world knows that I work with kids. I'm an educator in my other my other part of my life here. What is CaveSim and what does it bring to kids in the schools?
Yeah, so it's actually an excuse for us to get kids excited about the things they're already learning in school. So with CaveSim, we bring a trailer. Our trailers are between 26 and 31 feet long. The biggest one is the one I'm talking to you from right now, and it's got 150 feet of tunnels inside a 31-foot trailer. When you put a kid, and the kids go in groups with helmets and lights, when you put a kid through an experience like that, they go into a peak state, right? A psychologist would call it a peak state. And so what that means is that they're very, very receptive to lessons that you have to teach them about related topics, right? So they go into the CaveSim system. They're unsure about what the experience is going to be like, and they succeed, right? They come out and they feel a huge sense of accomplishment. And then we can talk with them about landforms if they're in fourth grade, right? Landforms in some, like in Colorado, landforms is a fourth grade standard. And if you just sat them in a classroom and you said, okay, we're going to talk about landforms, they may fall asleep. If they've just gone through this really exciting cave system and you talk about landforms, they're really, really interested. Or you want to talk about biology and talk about bats, or, you want to talk about, the physics. We have a vertical caving tower. It's only 12 feet tall, but we talk about pulleys and physics and forces and friction. All of that makes a lot more sense to them and is a lot more interesting when they're physically doing the activity. And then, of course, they're also learning about taking care of beautiful places. So if they bump into the stalactites that are artificial, that are inside of CaveSim, or they touch the bats, or they get too close to the cave paintings, they're going to hear a beeping sound. And the beeping is connected to this computer system, and their score gets worse for touching the objects. So they're learning about how they need to move carefully. And then they're learning things about how a person builds things. So I always ask the kids, how long do you think it took me to make this? And some kid will say a day or 2 hours or something. Well, actually it takes, 2 years to make one of our systems, because we're making all of the electronics completely from scratch, writing all the computer code, building the whole structure and everything. And so giving the kids an insight into how they could do something interesting with what they're learning in school, that's definitely a part of the program, right? So I talk with them about how I use my engineering and, my writing skills and my reading skills and all of the school subjects that they are experiencing in order to do my job with CaveSim.
How much fear and anxiety do the kids they show before they get into the cave?
They don't experience a whole lot. I typically work with second grade through 12th grade. If you end up, occasionally we'll work with pre-K, right? If you work with kids who are too young, they have a hard time. Their brains simply can't tell that it's not a real cave, right? You can tell them that, you can show them that it's in a trailer, but they'll look under the trailer to see if it goes under the ground, right? So a lot of times, a pre-K class will go through with their teacher in front and the aide in the back, right? Or a para in the back, right? And so they'll go through as a whole group and they tend to do pretty well. Once they get to second grade, they understand that it's a game and they may be intimidated. Obviously, the system has an emergency access points, and we've got 8 cameras, and we've got a PA system, and so we can check on the kids. We actually, in the latest version, we have a handicapped accessible area where a wheelchair can roll in, and that's a place where if somebody isn't happy, we can let them out. But it's very rare for them to need to be let out. Sometimes a kid will bail out, and then they'll say, I really wanted to do it, and I'll say, okay, why don't you try again and go just a little further. And we, of course, we're doing challenge by choice, right? We're not going to force the kids to do anything that they don't want to do. And we tell them that, right? We say, why don't you establish for yourself a challenge and see if you can meet that challenge. But the vast majority of kids go through and they have a great time and they want to go through again. And sometimes a kid will go through and they'll say, I'm claustrophobic. I don't think I can handle that. And, maybe they actually can't handle it, right? There's nothing. I must have hit one of my formations. It went off. There's nothing wrong with claustrophobia, right? It's basically the brain's way of protecting ourselves, right? And so I say, this is a perfectly safe environment for you to learn that you're not a fan of caves, and that's okay.
And it's interesting, the idea that the claustrophobia activation that you might see either in an actual cave or in CaveSim, to your point, it's a mental response to protect the brain. And then you could understand rationally that it's safe, right? This wall is not going to fall on me. I'm fine here. It's walking yourself past that and getting past that fear that helps you out. And I know too for myself, and this is my opinion, the way I see it, is we do children a favor by giving them the chance to appropriately address scary things and get through the other side of it. Because when you build the capacity to meet something head on and then move and then grow through that and be able to solve that problem, later on in their life, when another event comes up that is scary to them, they will flash back to the thing that they did. I did that hard thing and I could do this hard thing. Whereas a lot of children who struggle with anxiety, and I'm speaking in very broad brushes here, one reason why anxiety is a factor is that they think they have no capacity. They don't have the ability to get through this scary thing. And then by giving them the chance to come to CaveSim and do the scary thing, and I'm putting that word in quotes, therefore down the road, they could do the next thing, which might be intimidating to them. And so in many ways, you could argue that CaveSim is a social emotional tool to help children develop capacity.
Yes, it's absolutely true. And in fact, I actually tell them what you just said. In other words, if they do succeed at meeting their goal, whatever their goal is, then I tell them, and usually I tell them in the presence of a teacher, or if we're at a public event in the presence of their parent, so that the parent or the adult is listening as well and learning something too. I tell them exactly what you said. I always say, remember back to this. The next time you have some hard thing to do, remember back to this and tell yourself that you can do hard things. And, it works for adults too, right? I had a situation, because we do public events as well. I had a situation where I was at Cave of the Winds, which is a show cave here in Colorado. And I had it open to the public, and a guy came up and he said, my wife really wants me to do your CaveSim thing before I go on my tour. And he's like, I don't know if I want to do it, and I said, well, give it a try. So he goes in, comes right back out. And I said, how far'd you get? He's like, oh, well, I just could see the first hill. So why don't you try going up a little further, right? Just work your way up the rope. You can pull on the rope just as hard as you like. Try and go a little further. So he goes a little further, comes right back out. And this happens a couple times. And I said, it's just a fake cave made by, I was wearing my cowboy hat at the time. I said, it's just a fake cave made by a guy standing out here in a dumb looking hat. And sometimes a little bit of dark humor, or maybe self-deprecation is helpful for people. And so he goes and he does the whole thing, and he comes out and he goes on his tour with his wife, and he comes back later and he says, I was pinned down by gunfire in a cave in Afghanistan, and you've helped me a huge amount to get through that experience. And
holy cow.
To his massive credit, he was willing to work through that PTSD, right? And he and I took a picture together, and it was really, really extremely rewarding for me. We worked with Gold Star families. We work with all kinds of people who, the average person, but also people who face huge challenges.
Really something else. Amazing. Our time is starting to run through, and I want to be respectful of that. What I didn't ask before I wanted to come back to, from a fitness perspective, like what is the basic fitness level that's expected to be a successful caver?
Yeah, if you're going to be doing a lot of crawling, you need to have good core strength, right? And good arm strength, right? If you are going to be doing a lot of vertical, you need to it's interesting. A lot of vertical systems use leg strength, and you try to practice so that you're not relying upon your arm strength. I usually do a trick where when I'm holding my ascenders for going up a rope, I'm not gripping them very hard, because I want to force myself to use my leg strength instead of using my arm strength. It's interesting, though, you may actually find that as, if you get into caving, that you become better at it without actually strengthening yourself a huge amount. Your body learns how to move more effectively, more efficiently through the challenging spaces without exerting yourself as much as you did when you first start doing the activity.
When someone takes part in mountain climbing, runs a marathon, does an adventure race, the idea of the finish line is the goal. Is the goal of a caver to get in and out of the cave in one piece, or is there something deeper inside the cave that is the goal that brings you into the experience?
Yeah, the goal is certainly to get in and out in one piece, but there are additional goals that you can accomplish along the way, right? So perhaps you are, if you're me, perhaps you're bringing a team of mostly new people, right? And the goal is to give them a good experience, a positive experience where they're excited to do, future caving expeditions. So if you're on a survey trip, looking at mapping a passage, how many miles of passage or kilometers of passage can you map in that trip? If you are, so on some of these trips, there may be camps set up inside the cave, right? So, can we get to Camp 3? Can we get to Camp 4? Can we, resupply this equipment cache in order to support future trips? Some of these expeditions are long, drawn out expeditions. And so there may be kind of sub goals. But sometimes it's just a matter of, I'd really like to see this cave. I haven't been in this cave before. I really want to get back to the room with all the beautiful helictites or the dogtooth spar or whatever, and see beautiful things.
And I'm assuming too, and this might be a misconception of my own coming across, I think you've clarified that, is that when you speak to a non-caver, it's the idea that you just go into the ground and you go through these tunnels and you see a lot of dirt and it's the same color and it's cold. But I think what you're saying is that caves are unique ecosystems and everyone is different and worth seeing, much like you have with different mountain ranges, different trails, things like that. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I like caving in different parts of the country. Some of my friends go caving overseas a lot, but I like caving in different parts of the country because the caves in Tennessee and Alabama, they have salamanders. Our caves here in Colorado, you're going to not really find salamanders, but you may find some ancient bones from sloths, right? We have some caves here where there are bone digs and you'll find ancient stuff. We don't bring anything out with us, right? Our goal is to just simply look at the amazing things in the cave and leave them for the next person. But it's neat to see the different ecosystems around the country. Earlier I mentioned Neversink Pit, the 160-foot pit. There are glowworms. So you go at night and you look up and you see all these glowworms, and the glowworms are trying to trick the little insects into flying into their webs. That's why they glow. But it's really, really cool to look up and see what looks like the night sky.
How many bats are you running into? Big bat caves?
Unfortunately, there's an issue with our bats. We have a lot of bats that have died, close to 100 million bats or something have died since the mid 2000s with a disease called white nose syndrome. Yeah. And it's a fungus and it attacks the bats and basically eats the bats alive, metabolizes the bats alive. And so unfortunately, we've had this huge crash in our bat population. So when we do see bats in caves, we're not going to bother the bats. I always tell kids, this is their home and they're in there to sleep, right? And so, you could turn a red light on if you see a bat instead of using your white light. You're going to use a low voice, try and be quiet as you go near the bats.
Amazing, fascinating stuff. Anything I didn't ask you about caving that as someone, a neophyte, not getting the sport and activity, I should have asked? Anything you want to fill me in on?
Yeah, absolutely. So for your listeners who are interested in getting into caving, I would definitely point them in the direction of caves.org. Caves.org is the website of the National Speleological Society, and that basically means the National Caving Club. And there are branches of this NSS organization all around the country, and the trips are free. And, maybe you pay membership dues of $10 a year or something like that to the local clubs. That's the best way to do this activity safely. You don't really want to see cavers on a cave rescue situation because you screwed up. You actually want to get into it the right way. So I would definitely point people to caves.org. And then if you want to learn about CaveSim, you can certainly go to cavesim.com. And we're going to be going to California later this month for some free public programs. We'll be going to the East Coast. If you want to see where we are, you can always visit cavesim.com/calendar.
A lot of our listeners are involved in education, whether teachers themselves, administrators, things like that. You mentioned the East Coast, mentioned California. I'm assuming that CaveSim is available to orchestrate with different parks and recreations departments, different schools, summer camps. Like you're just pick a spot, you'll travel there and off you go.
Yes, exactly. We set up a tour, right? So that the organizations can share the transportation cost. And so we'll work with libraries, schools, museums, state parks, national parks, cities, all kinds of organizations. And we have been to 21 states at this point, and we're looking to add more.
Excellent. Any closing thoughts there, Dave, before I let you go? I know that you're working in the CaveSim right now. I want to let you get back to work. Close us out. What's the last thing you want to say?
Oh, gosh, we got to think about that one a little bit. I would just tell people, as adventure racers, you're already doing this, right? But I would tell people to follow your passion, right? And do something that excites you. I used to design computer chips for a living. It was ungodly boring. And I quit my job, took a lot of bravery to quit my job. I quit my job to do CaveSim full time. And I'm really, really glad I did. I think, following your passion, being brave, jumping into things is a good thing.
Well, there you have it, folks. Episode 121 of The Dark Zone. Hope you enjoyed your time today with us. Dave was a great interview. I got a little panicky during the interview, not going to lie. Got a little tight space chest pain while he was talking about some of those rescues. But he walked us through it together, and that was a good thing. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please head to your platform of choice and like and click and subscribe. That is of great help to us as the algorithm gets to understand who the TDZ fan base is. And remember, if you keep racing, we'll keep talking.